Well, hello again, and welcome to the continuation of our studies looking at Luke's Gospel. Today we're in Luke chapter 8, and we're going to look at verses 22 to 25. So if you'd like to follow along, I invite you to pull out a Bible. So Luke 8 and verses 22 to 25. So one day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." So they got out into a boat and set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came upon the lake, so that the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are going to drown." He got up, rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided, and all was calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked his disciples. In fear and amazement, they asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." Now, this is a very useful episode to understand who Jesus is, because that's the question that's actually posed at the end. Who is this? And this is very much the theme of the first part of Luke's Gospel. Who is this man? Who is Jesus? And so let's explore Jesus' identity here. We've obviously already come across Jesus healing people in Luke's Gospel, driving out demons. And remember, it's the word that does the work of God. How does Jesus calm the storm here? Well, he speaks to the storm. He gets up, he rebukes the wind and the raging waters, and the storm subsided. So again, here in Luke's Gospel, it's the word that does the work. The word of Jesus calms this storm. So again, there's a clue to the identity of Jesus here. If Jesus can calm a storm, then what does it say about Jesus' power? It's greater than the storm. And so here is Jesus, who we know is God. And the question that's being asked, who do you think he is? The disciples at this point maybe partly recognize who Jesus was, but they don't completely recognize him, or they wouldn't have had such a sort of a fear episode about the storm if they recognized that God was with them in this boat. So the fact that Jesus calms this storm shows that he is God himself. Now, think of a couple of episodes from history about this. I don't know if you know the story of King Canute. He famously went into the sea on the south coast of England and was going to prove that he had power over the waves by stopping the waves coming in. But he proved to be mightily unsuccessful and ended up becoming very wet instead. And another commentator who spoke about these verses has said that he can't even stop the mini waves in his bathwater, never mind stopping these raging waves on the Sea of Galilee. So the power that Jesus shows here over the storm shows his identity as God himself. And it should also ring a bell about an Old Testament episode. I don't know if this bell rang for you, but surely the story of Jonah should come to mind. Do you remember the story of Jonah in the Old Testament, where Jonah is on a boat fleeing from God? And where is he? Well, he is asleep in the boat, and then a storm comes, and they wake up Jonah, and they throw him over the side of the boat, and then there's complete calm. You know the rest of the story is swallowed by the big fish, etc. But the first part is on the boat, where Jonah is also asleep, but Jonah is actually thrown into the waves to calm the storm. And surely this is an echo of the book of Jonah. Jesus is asleep in the boat. So Jesus is a Jonah-like figure. And Jesus is going to say later in the Gospels about how just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish or the great whale for 3 days, so Jesus is going to be beneath the ground for 3 days and 3 nights before, if you like, being resurrected in the same way Jonah was sort of resurrected out of the death in the depths of the fish. So there are parallels with Jonah. And the interesting thing here, obviously, is Jesus isn't cast into the waves himself to calm the storm. Here, he simply speaks to the waves. But later on in the gospel, thinking about this, the spiritual echo of this in the cross, it's on the cross that Jesus is thrown into the storm, if you like, of God's wrath, and Jesus calms that storm through his death on the cross. His death brings us peace and calm, if you like, from the storms that God could bring into our lives because of the sin that we've committed. So Jesus brings peace here to the storm, and there's a greater peace that's achieved through his death on the cross when Jesus is thrown into the storm on our behalf. So, as I say, there's an echo here of the book of Jonah. There's another lesson here other than the identity of Jesus, and the lesson for the disciples. It's about the nature of faith. So notice what Jesus says to them in verse 25. Where is your faith? He asks the disciples. So he doesn't say to the disciples, you've got no faith, but he says, where is your faith? So this helps us to understand a little bit about the nature of faith itself. Faith is not a feeling. It's not a sort of a mystical sensation or mystical thing. Faith is an activity. And Jesus is, if you like, telling his disciples off here because they've got faith, but they're not exercising it. They're not putting it into practice. They're not seeing the situation and applying their faith to it. Now, what would applying faith to this situation actually look like? Well, if they really recognized who Jesus was, then they wouldn't have been afraid because they would know that they're with God in the boat. And if they're with God, then they can be assured of their safety. They can be assured of peace and calm with Jesus. And if God is our good shepherd, God, Jesus, will look after them. So what they fail to do is exercise their faith. They have faith, but they fail to exercise it. And to exercise our faith means looking at the objects of our faith. Faith is not about just us. Faith is us exercising faith, trust in an object. And the object of our faith, obviously, is Jesus, is God. And so it's trusting God in the difficult situation. So for the disciples here, exercising faith would mean trusting that God is a good shepherd and he is sovereign. He's in charge of the situation and he cares about them. So often the question we ask ourselves, and I'm sure the disciples were asking at this point, is, does Jesus really care? It looks like we're going to drown. Looks like we're going to be swamped in this boat. We're going to die in this particular situation. Does Jesus really care? And I guess that's the question we often ask of God, isn't it? Does God really care? Is God really that bothered about the storms that may be in our lives at this point? Well, what we need to do is exercise our faith. And that means trusting in the object of our faith. The object of our faith is Jesus. So because Jesus is the object of our faith, it doesn't actually matter whether our faith is great or small, because it's the object of our faith that's important. It's not how much faith we have, it's the object of our faith. So let me put that into an illustration. I borrowed this from Tim Keller, who probably borrowed this from somewhere else. But he gave this illustration. Suppose I fall off a cliff, and just as I'm falling off the cliff, I grab a branch. Now, two options here. Is it better to have a strong faith in a weak branch, or is it better to have a weak faith in a strong branch? What's the thing that's really important? Well, the important thing really is the strength of the branch, isn't it? We can have really strong faith, but if the branch is weak and snaps, we've had it. We can have a weak faith, but if the branch is strong, it will support our weight. And so for us, the object of our faith is Jesus. Will Jesus support our weight? And the answer is yes, because Jesus is the strong branch. He is the rock, is one way that Jesus is described. And so therefore, the object of our faith, Jesus, determines the outcome. It's not how much faith we've got. So hence Jesus' other phrase elsewhere in the Gospels, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can do this, that, and the other. We'll probably get to that on one of our later studies. So we shouldn't be too worried about how much faith we've got, but look at the object of our faith, who is Jesus. We only need a little bit, a mustard seed of faith. And if Jesus is God, then we can trust in him because Jesus is good. Jesus is wise. Jesus is in charge. So at the moment, if you're struggling through particular circumstances, difficulties, trials, the storms of life, exercise your faith. I mean, put your trust in Jesus. Put your trust in Jesus as God, as the good shepherd who cares for his sheep.